Welcome to our story, Maxwell and Dad, a place where we celebrate the extraordinary journey of fatherhood to a son who is differently able. We discuss single parenting, we discuss co-parenting, we discuss all things fatherhood. So again, welcome. I'm your host, Brandon McAfee, affectionately known as Maxwell's dad. I'm the father to a beautiful baby boy, Maxwell McAfee, whom we call Super Mighty Max. Welcome to episode 3. I thank you for tuning in to episode 2 on last week when we did the first part of my interview with Dr. Keish. And again, this is episode 3. So this time I'm going to invite Dr. Keish to the platform as we continue in our conversation about parenting a child who is differently abled.
Hey, I'm glad to be back. And so returning it over to me, you ready
Yes.
to be in the hot seat and have me ask you all the questions? So
Yeah. Well, are you in the hot seat or am I in the hot seat? Because
you're
you
in the
just got to
hot
ask
seat because I'm
questions.
interviewing you. So you're in the hot
Right.
seat. You're the one who has to give the answers.
Uh-huh.
All right. So we have had a beautiful conversation last week talking about your caregiving, your being a caregiver to Max. And so this week, I want to talk about you as a pastor as it relates to special needs. And
Okay.
so I'm going to first come and ask you it from a personal perspective. What has it been like for you as a pastor? As you have entered into spaces, as you have actually pastored your own churches as it relates to special needs?
Yeah, it's been a journey to say the least. Uh Again, let me just say thank you for for helping with this process and or that you do to make this space and this content possible. But yes, it's been a journey. I think about before I had Maxwell, before Maxwell was born. Um, he that he I pastored 2 churches before he was born, and both of those churches, my first church, St. Matthew, in Weldon, North Carolina. There was a gentleman as an adult. He was differently able. I never took the time to find out what his diagnosis was, what his condition was. I just knew that he was differently able in some capacity. Faithful, great, but I never took the time to really explore. And I never thought about doing ministry or how he received that ministry, how he connected with God. Just it wasn't on my frame of mind. My second church, St. Mark, Smithfield, North Carolina. That's where Maxwell was born. But again, we had a young man who was there, who was differently able, maybe 2. And again, just never. It's kind of like, love you, your pastor. But again, I didn't think about what is ministry like? What is church like for them? Um, it wasn't until, again, Maxwell was born to I began thinking like, man, like, all right, well, how when Maxwell gets older, how will he, receive God? How will he connect with God? How do we connect with people in general who are differently able, who have some kind of, who have a need? And again, it's not always. I mean, disabilities is a long range, vast range of disabilities, and so whether it's being hearing impaired or whether it's being visually impaired, whether it's being mental health, whatever the case may be, whether it may be something physical. I know we have a gentleman in our church who have prosthetic legs. So again, it's a whole host of different things. But again, I just didn't think about any of that until I had my own son. And so it's definitely made me, I think, more sensitive and compassionate with people. But it's definitely made me think, well, how do we do ministry to people who don't show up, quote unquote, normally? We live in a very ableist society. And so, I look through that lens now. And I'm not saying that I'm always 100% on it, but, I look through, that lens and I'm more compassionate. And when I go to certain spaces, as you know, being AME, we have what's called the Christian Education Congress, or now we call it the Summer Summit. We have, hundreds, if not, at least 1,000 kids from, Maryland, Virginia, Washington, D.C., North Carolina come and, converge on wherever we are, in that season. But never have, if you go to a public school, right, public schools are mandated legally to provide services and education, to children who are differently able. They have to. But when we go to these conferences, these youth conferences, what do we have for them? It is, we put the onus on the parent or the caregiver, to make sure it's we put the responsibility on them for their children to access, whatever workshop is going on, whatever activities are going on. But never have I've been in a conversation, and I've brought it up before a time or two, but it's never been, hey, let's make it more accessible, or let's do this, or some kind of survey or anything to find out, do you have any children who are differently able, who have any kind of special needs? We want to do something this year to kind of cast a wide net. Those conversations aren't happening, or at least I haven't been a part of or heard of them happening. And so I think, especially the church, I say the church. I don't even want to say the Black church or the white church, but of course I pastor in a Black church, traditionally Black church. But I said, we need to do a better job, be quite frankly, and I included, right? I need to do a better job as well. And I just, I shared in the last week's episode about at St. John how we have the disability awareness service, in which we, try to share awareness, and I preach about it. But there's more stuff that can be done. And there's more stuff, at least in my context, that will be done, or that continue down this journey. And again, part of this, this podcast, these conversations that we're having is my effort to make people more aware, but also to educate myself and having conversations with different people, and kind of to force myself to learn and to grow, and hopefully others who watch this and who are part of this community will learn and grow, and maybe we can start conversations, but move from conversations to, okay, what are we doing? So yeah.
So that already makes me think about a video that a friend tagged me in recently, where they happen to be white, but that's neither here nor there. But they were talking about what it meant to actually have a child that, I can't remember if their child was autistic or they were ADHD. I don't remember the diagnosis, but they said that basically they had stopped going to church because it was so hard for them to go to church, because there was no one who could take care of their child. So in service, their child wasn't learning, was being disruptive. There were looks, there were so many, aspects that came to it. So they really had not gone to church. And then they ended up finding out about a church who specifically had a children's ministry that was for children who were differently abled. And so to see the video was beautiful, because actually, I remember who sent me the video, our classmate Ronay.
Yeah, she sent it to me too.
Right. Yeah. But just that whole idea of what it meant to see, them taking care of kids who had a vast range of differently able, things that they were actually able to do. So kids who couldn't use who used the bathroom on themselves, and to see that level of concern and care and volunteerism was absolutely a beautiful thing to see. And so I think that very much so, kind of talks about how it is we can do it. So how do you think that you can empower parents to try to get churches, if that's something that they want? What advice would you give to empower them to try to help their, congregations be more welcoming?
Yeah. Before I answer that, in the last week's episode, I mentioned how life can be messy at times. And what I meant by that is kind of what you said. Maxwell will use the bathroom on himself, and sometimes it's just messy, right? And it's a lot of work cleaning, or sometimes he might be drooling and just and so it might be messy, but again, it's a beautiful, like I love it's a beautiful mess. That's my son, and so it's not always as clean and neat. And I think that's what it is. In that video, right, we saw the children, just doing things and just running around the church, and it might look chaotic, but these kids are having fun. And so I think we have to jump right into it and just embrace the beauty that God allows us to be a part of. But to answer your question, I think parents have to advocate for their children, and that's one thing I try to do is advocate for Maxwell, because as it relates to Maxwell's case, he can't speak up for himself. He can't say when something hurts, or verbally. He can cry, and I try to discern or decipher what that means, but he can't audibly using words speak up for himself. And so it's our job, even kids who, again, quote unquote neurotypical, it's our responsibility to advocate for our children. One of the things that I've always, and I don't know why, or God put this passion in my heart, but the idea of exclusion, I hate anybody being excluded. It's just I don't know, I just hate that feeling of exclusion. And so I believe in inclusivity, and so again, it's our responsibility. If people aren't going out of their way to open doors, to create spaces, for our children, for our babies, then we have to create those spaces. We have to, have those conversations. And I dare say again, I'm challenging my own self, as I mentioned a few moments ago, in these kind of connectional spaces, having those conversations, advocating, in those spaces. How do we create space, whether it's at a conference, at a district meeting, at a local, connection meeting, or just in our local churches? How do we create spaces? And I think somebody has to say something, because again, there's a child, there's a family that's desiring, that's looking for a place to, that's compassionate and that's loving, to take their children, and they, for whatever reason, don't know who to talk to, or don't know what to say, or just don't say anything. But we need people who are willing to say something. The reason why we have disability rights as it stands right now is because somebody said something. Somebody spoke up. I went to the Portrait Museum on yesterday, on last week, and at the Portrait Museum, I took a picture of this woman, and I can't remember her name. She was in a wheelchair, and she is the one who helped expand disability rights. And again, there's more details, but again, it's kind of hazy. But she advocated, she raised her voice, and whether it's voting rights, whether it's our civil rights, whether it's the right to vote, whether it's women's suffrage movement, all the things that we have that weren't just readily given to us, it's because somebody opened their mouth and advocated for those things. So I think in the same way, even in the church, we have to advocate for the needs of our children.
Great point. I want to now transition us into considering the Bible and how the Bible handles, people who are differently able. So first, it is an ancient document, right? And so I know, some people's theology is like, everything in the Bible, is useful. And so it's hard for them to pick apart and question aspects of the Bible. We're seminary trained, and seminary definitely gets you to pick apart, the biblical text and to be okay with it. So as an ancient document, it does not translate into the way that we have learned as a society to look in modern times and treat people who are differently able. And so oftentimes when the biblical text talks about people who are differently able, they frame them in terms of they need to be healed. And so there's only one character that I can think about in the Bible who seems to have just been, they laid out that he was differently abled and just left it at that. And that is Mephibosheth. Right. So how would you say that our theological understanding of people who are differently able is affected by how the Bible handles it and how people that are, entrusted with the biblical text then frame it.
Yeah, I think that's a loaded question, and not a loaded question, but that's a hard question. And I think um I think it starts with the lens you look through, the lens in which you look through text, and you know, yeah, and our own theology, how you understand God is God a loving God? Is God a God of liberation? Is God an inclusive God, or is God, this fire and brimstone? Is God this, kind of parent, patriarchal figure who's, always punishing and doling out, um, uh, again, consequences for people's actions? And I think a lot of times in the scriptures, right, we see something happen to somebody who's differently able, and the question, well, who sinned? Did they sin, or did their parents sin, um, or again, we live in such an ableist society, and so um, that we think that if somebody is so we want people to be healed, and we think if somebody's differently able, that somehow they're deficient, and that they need healing, right? That somehow something happened along the way, that God made some mistake, or something happened and they need to be healed, versus seeing people as if, this person is still created in the image and likeness of God. Seeing someone and saying that they are beautifully and wonderfully made in their mother's womb. Um, and so I think it does depend on how the preacher, how the pastor, approaches the biblical text, how they handle the biblical text and their own theology, and how they see others. And how they see others. So for me, again, being a father to Maxwell, it definitely helped me to ask some tough questions, to consider some things, to look at text differently. And I can dare and I'll say that I at times have been guilty of, God, heal my son. Uh, God, heal my son. I want my son to walk. I want my son to talk. I want my son to be, again, normal. And then I had to question myself, um, does Maxwell need to be healed? Right. And so of course, like, he has this baseline. So if he gets the cold, right, I want him to return back to baseline. But if God allowed Maxwell to be born like this, am I okay with accepting and embracing Maxwell as he is? Because perhaps me asking God to heal him and have him walk is me saying that Maxwell is deficient, or that him not walking is that something's wrong with him because he can't walk. That God made a mistake, that God didn't intend for him to be like this, and that he needs to be healed of his mobility challenges, because he can't talk. That again, something's wrong with him and needs to be healed of that and be able to talk. That God needs to do something. Perhaps God, which I believe, said Maxwell is beautifully and wonderfully made. He was formed in his mother's womb. That Maxwell is created in the image and likeness of God. Yes, he cannot talk. Yes, he cannot walk. Yes, he has seizures at times, and yes, so on and so forth. But Maxwell is still created in the image and likeness of God. And for me, I've been able to embrace and being able to accept him for who he is. And so now what I pray is, God, I pray that you allow Maxwell to be all that you have called him to be.
Powerful.
I pray, Lord, that you will allow Maxwell to grow and develop as you see fit. And so it's just really just inviting God to do what only God can do, whatever that is. You know, I'm open, God, whatever it is. Whatever you want Maxwell to do on this journey, I'm open to it, and I accept it. And I'm going to love him either way. And I think even us who, again, quote unquote normal, who are neurotypical, whether it be adult or children, we could learn something in accepting us for who we are, accepting ourselves, right? We don't know what Paul's thorn in his flesh was. You know, many scholars have many different kind of things. But whatever our stuff is, whatever we have, what if we just embrace, like how free and how liberating is it to embrace and accept yourself for who you are, to love your son or your daughter for who they are, to love your spouse for who they are, to meet people where they are and love them, and allow God to do a work with them, whatever that work may be. I don't know. That's so that hasn't always been where I was, but that's kind of where I've kind of evolved and grown to be. I remember, again, talking to a pastor back in maybe 2015, 2016, and I was just struggling, just struggling with Maxwell and, his condition. And just because, as a father, right, and someone who plays sports, I had, aspirations and dreams and goals for, what I want to do with my son. And I remember this pastor challenging me to just accept Max for who he is. Just accept him. Just to accept it. And that was hard at the time. I didn't want to accept it. I had to grieve. I had to grieve just my expectations and grieve my dreams and grieve my hopes for the son I imagined that I would have. To accept and embrace the son that I do have. And to love him fully. And again, that's the reason why I post him so much. I love him. And he's my son who I'm well pleased in. And even in talking about grief, I think at times, I think I live with a kind of perpetual grief. In that not that I don't accept him, because I fully accept him, but just, always want to make sure he's okay. Always want to make sure that, again, that nothing happens to him that, that he can't come back from. Unfortunately, Maxwell, he does go to the hospital more times than I would like, just for whether it be a cold or routine, things. And it's just, literally, whether it's his medications, his therapies, certain things, is just, his life is in my hands. And I don't think it's any different than maybe, any parent in caring for a child, but wanting to make sure he's always okay, that he always has what he needs. And, kind of worrying, trusting God, but also, worrying, just being honest. And just the unknown, not knowing. So yeah. And so theologically, I think it will help to look through a lens of, his mother, Erica, she didn't sin. I didn't sin. This is just how God allowed Maxwell to come into the world. Your child, whether it's Down syndrome, whether it's whatever it is not how they are because of some sin, because of some evil, because of some hex. No, like, life happens. And God's sovereignty, and God allows certain things to happen. But we accept them and we embrace them. And again, it could be that this is the gift that God wanted to bless us with.
Mhm.
Um, and learning to look at all people in their uniqueness and their beauty, and embrace them, accept them for who they are. So, hope that answers the question.
It does. Um, so to kind of push a little further in on that, how can churches learn to adapt texts so that they are considering families that may be present? And sometimes you can see the neurodivergent aspect of a child, and sometimes you can't. How can the church, preachers, and pastors adapt the text so that they are more welcome, creating more welcoming environments and affirming families and children who are, and people, honestly, because, you know, someday I was like, people who have ADHD, people who may have autism grow into adults and they're still sitting in our pulpits and we sitting in our congregations and we don't always know that. And then other differently abled aspects that we just need to learn from. Because I remember one of my friends, and it wasn't that he had that he was differently able, but he developed cancer, and he talked about how he was scared to go to a new church that did not know him, with them knowing that he had cancer, because people don't want to look at their pastors as somebody who has a frailty that, and so how do we as a church use texts that affirm people rather than ostracize or tear them down so that we can create more welcoming environments?
I think of the scripture that we say and read we recite and read every first Sunday. Love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, mind, and soul. Love thy neighbor as thyself. So I think in order to be able to love and fully embrace someone else, we have to be able to fully love and embrace ourselves. So I think, first starting with love, fully loving ourselves of who we are, and being honest with ourselves. Like, again, none of us are perfect. We all have our shortcomings. We all have things about us that we wish were different, or whatever the case may be. Perhaps. And then fully loving someone else. And fully loving someone else, I think that allows us to be open and willing to finding ways to love them. And when you love somebody, you want them to be accepted. You want to embrace them. You want them to be included. You're more compassionate. So I think starting with love, starting with trying to be aware, starting with prayer. God, I have this family in my congregation. How can we be more welcoming? How can we be more accepting? How can we ensure that they experience God in their own way, like we experience God? And it might just be having a conversation. I believe a lot can happen over a conversation, and being willing to just listen. Not listening to respond, but just listening to listen, see what people need. In what ways we can serve persons, and they might not know, but creatively, putting our heads together and seeing, how can we do this? But I think just being willing being loving and being willing is a great start. Yeah, I think that's a great start.
So we're gonna go mix it up a little bit
All
here.
right. Okay.
So
Ready. I think.
You said you think it's okay.
Yeah.
It's okay. It's all right.
All right.
Have you ever experienced in church, church hurt is a huge thing. Have you experienced, church hurt as it relates to Maxwell, or have you ever had an experience that just kind of threw you, like they just really, mess with my child? We always, if anything is going to make us put them up, it's the children. People mess with our children. And so how has that been for you in terms of having a child that was differently abled and coming into congregations or spaces where they may not have been as informed and as enlightened as they needed to be?
Yeah. So, you don't want to name churches, anything like that. So I try my best, but if anybody knows me, they probably can figure things out. But at one of my churches in the past, I remember uh, getting in a disagreement with one of the musicians, or the musician, and having to sit him down for just some stuff, some nonsense he was doing, and this went on, and periodically we would have conversations. Weren't always, yeah, they weren't. On God rest his soul, that they weren't amicable conversations. They were, were pretty tense. And I remember having this conversation with him, and then, at the time, I was married to Maxwell's mother, Erica, and I remember he went on to say something like, "Yeah, you mad because your wife be looking at me and all this kind of stuff." Yeah, yeah. I'm like, "Yeah, nah, she looking at anybody. It definitely ain't you, bro." um, but then I remember him going on and saying, and the way you are, that's why your son is how he is. That's why it's like it's your fault because how you are. And I'm like, yeah, you're never coming back to play at this church while I'm here. And anywhere I am, you would never play. If we invite that church, and I'm at another church, I'm gonna tell the pastor like you can't play, or it was just like no, it was very nasty, very nasty, just mean spirited. So that was an instance. And then at another church, a little more recent, not my current church, but being there, and I remember it was saying they were kind of like, see, so pastor's always late. Pastor's always late. You get to church always late. And it wasn't like I was getting to church that late. It might, if service started at 11, I might have been getting there like 11:05, sometimes 11:10. Maybe at a rare occasion 11:30. But it, and we lived 2 hours away at that time. So anything can happen driving 2 hours. Anything can happen. And so if church started at 11, we lived 2 hours away. We had to get on the road at least by 9. And then again, Maxwell's mother at the time, typically on Sunday mornings, she got him ready. And so that meant that she was waking up early, 6-7 o'clock, to make his food, to give him his medication, to give him a bath, to get him dressed, then to get herself ready, to get herself dressed, get her, put her, girl, put, Sonny, put her beat on, like do all the stuff, right? And so it was a whole task, and just get Maxwell in the car, get him out the door, like it was a lot. And so it was like, what, like y'all drive 5 minutes, 10 minutes to church. We're driving 2 hours. And then on top of that, you don't understand what we have to do just to, get out the door. And so I just felt like it was very insensitive and ignorant of them, and ignorant not being a derogatory, but just not knowing what we had to do. And so like after that kind of conversation and kind of mumbling was going on for a while, I finally had to have a conversation. Like, nah, like what? Like what are we talking about? Like Al Narvis said, practice. We talking about practice. It was like 5 minutes late. We talking about being 5 minutes. Like, what we got to go through to get, it was just like, and so that was, yeah, that was just, I just felt like there's really a lack of awareness and a lack of compassion in some ways. Yeah, and so I would think those two instances really stand out. Yeah.
What would you say to a parent who's watching and they've experienced, somebody saying or doing, not being in a welcoming community? How would you speak to them?
I wouldn't, one, I would be empathetic. I would validate their experiences. I think that's important. And I would encourage them. One, ask them, what would you want to see happen? What would you like to see happen? But and two, encourage them to have a conversation, with their pastor, their priest, or the imam, or whatever the case may be, to have a conversation. Because sometimes people just don't know. for whatever reason. You would think that, oh, they should know what we go. No, sometimes people don't know. And so I think have the conversation, give folk grace. Then if they still choose to be stupid, then and lack compassion, then and then I think, okay, you move on. Well, then you have to assess, well, how committed are you to that particular space? Do you want to fight and advocate, or are you just, what, let's find another space. And prayerfully that's the decision, because again, church hurt is real. I remember again when started just kind of reading up on people's experiences in churches, and reading that, I don't go to church because my child has autism and so on and so forth, and I've seen it. I remember being at a church, and they were having a revival, and I was walking into the church, and as I was walking in, this family, the son and father were walking in, and as they went, I said, they asked me for food or something, I don't know, and I think I had like a Paul and Silas moment or something, like, silver and gold have I do not have, in the name of Jesus. And so I invited the father, to come into worship with me. And I went to one side and they sat on the other side. I remember during the service, like the son was like hitting the father on, like on top of the head, like with a bulletin, is making a lot of noise and outbursts. And I just felt like, oh man, like I invited them in here. And it's like, ooh. And it was, I guess, as we think about norm, it was disruptive, of the kind of the norm. And I sure went over there, hey, like, y'all have to quiet down. And the child kept acting out. You got quiet. And the child had to be probably like 10 years old or something, 10, 12 years old. And then finally, the church, the usher, after maybe like 2 or 3 times trying to, help ask them to quiet down and, get the child, under control, they asked them to leave. And I just told, like, man, I invited them in here. And I just thought to myself, there has to be another way. We can't ask people to leave. Like, there has to be another way, how we serve families. When again, whatever the disability may be, it has to be a different way. We have to have people, as much as we can, who are either experienced and trained, or give folk who are experienced and trained. It just has to be another way, and I just feel bad, and it's like, whatever we do, we can't do that. Like that's not the answer. And again, great church. And again, this is no shade to the church, but it's just, I think just lack the experience in that situation.
Yeah. I totally understand it, because I have seen children who, especially in our context, you're like, oh, they just don't know how to handle their child, and I'm like, so I have very actively been telling myself, you don't know, if something deeper is going on. It may not just be that the parents are allowing their child to, quote unquote, get away with something. It may just be that their child has some sort of learning disability, something that is causing this behavior that you don't see and that you don't know. So instead of, intervening and being upset about your discomfort, let's just, let them handle it, trust that the family knows what they're doing, and, move on in love, and just let people do and handle what they need to handle. And sometimes, you need to just have a separate conversation with people to understand and to grow and to become a more loving community and a more loving person, because it doesn't always happen in church. We can be on airplanes with children who are differently able, and we're just worried about ourselves being, in a place of discomfort. And this family is trying to do the best they can do. And so we as a community, or as people, need to learn to be able to be more welcoming and understanding of people, because you never know when, you might have somebody in your family, or, be presented with that situation. Absolutely. So getting ready to close on out here.
All right.
And I'm going to close the way I did with the last one. Do you have any books or resources you recommend to our listeners and churches specifically, just in case, somebody needs to slide their pastor a book to help them, that would allow them to learn about being more welcoming communities and about looking from different theological perspectives?
I had a whole week, right, to get some kind of bibliography or something together. I knew you were going to ask us, having an intellect and an academic interview was like, she's going to ask me about resources. I would have to. I know in my iPad, I have a bunch of resources that I purchased, but I don't like right now. The only book I can think of off the top of my head, I think it's called The Disabled God.
Yes.
I think it's by Nancy Eastland or someone Eastland.
Yeah, I think it's Eastland.
Yeah, so that book, The Disabled God, I will look at her. The PCUSA, Presbyterian Church USA, has a good resource. As a matter of fact, I saw it as I was looking through my favorites the other day, and we can put it in the show notes or in the comments because I can't think off the top of my head right now. There's another gentleman who doesn't always talk about in terms of like being differently abled or this conversation, but he's done workshops on it. I know at Semi Do It Proctor Conference, a guy named Kyle Stevenson, who I believe he also has CP, and he's a preacher, an academic, brilliant gentleman. You can find him on Facebook or Instagram. Maybe some of his resources. Again, he approaches stuff from a faith perspective. That's all I can think of at this moment, and that's one thing. And again, that I plan to get better on is just my knowledge and as I one day finish my dissertation, be more of a wealth of information, knowledge. I'm like, look, 6 months from now, I'm like, yeah, this book, that book, my book. But
okay, claim books. All right, I hear you.
But yeah, at the moment, I do not. Those are the resources I can think of off the top of my head. But again, I know in my Amazon histories, I purchased a lot of just, books that had to deal with theology and religion and disability studies. One thing I will say though, there is not a lot of resources through a Black lens, through the Black church lens. That's one thing I will say. One, there's not a lot of resources out there in general on this subject, relatively speaking, but definitely through a Black church lens, there's not a lot of resources out there. We're worrying about, growing churches and, bringing millennials back to church and preaching and all that's good and with, good and great. But there has to be more than just every conference. How do I grow my church? How do millennials, come in? Like, this has to be more, to it than that.
So what I also hear you saying along with the book is that you're going to actually, submit a abstract to try to get a workshop at some of these conferences. I hear you.
Yeah. That's what I'm saying. You took the words right out my mouth. Wow. But yes, I am. And again, people for whatever reason, right, are more loyal or to certain conferences than others, and but I do know the Same with Proctor Conference, and however you feel about the conference. I know that I think last year, the year before last, I think don't quote me, but I think Kyle Stevenson, who I just mentioned, and Dr. Jeremiah Wright Jr., I think they did a workshop together as it relates to being differently able, either together or they did one separately. But Dr. Wright, who I mentor, prolific preacher, pastor, scholar, par excellence. He had a stroke a couple years ago, and so now, in some ways, I guess we can term him differently able, just because he shows up in the world, differently, certain spaces differently. And so, and I wanted to so bad to go to that conference to hear his perspective and just, hear what he had to say. I wasn't able to make it. But I do think in our conferences, we have to, because these families are in our churches, period, point blank, or they want to be in our churches and we haven't shown ourselves welcoming and accommodating.
Come on now, because we worried about growing churches and we got families who want to come, but we're too busy trying to read what's the fad and not considering welcoming communities are places where people want to come.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. Yep. Yeah.
So that's all I got for you, bro.
Well, thank you again to all those who tuned into episode 3. As always, you can follow us on Instagram at Maxwell and Dad. Again, Maxwell and Dad. Just how it's said, Maxwell and Dad. You can follow us on Facebook. Like us, our page on Facebook, Maxwell and Dad. Feel free to leave your comments in the chat. Let's keep it clean. Let's keep it professional. Let's keep it positive. Feel free to share this with your network. If this blessed you and you want to share it with someone, feel free to share it. Feel free to post it on your page, send a link to somebody else. And then feel free, again, to be a part of our community as I strive to spread awareness, to share my journey, our story, Maxwell and Dad, of fatherhood, of raising a differently able child, of being a single parent, being a co-parent, of being a Black father, most importantly, and being a man of God who loves his son, who's a child of God. And so, again, thank you for tuning in. Thank you, Dr. Harris, for your work and all that you do. Thank you for these questions, and thank you for just being you and again, and assisting in this process. And so, again, that's episode 3. And thank y'all for hanging out. God bless y'all.